A $1 bill changed hands under the fluorescent hum of the Wexler County Annex, and the woman who slid it across the counter did not flinch when the clerk laughed. Delia Marchbanks laid the single crumpled note flat, smoothed it with 2 fingers as if it were something worth smoothing, and waited for the deed to be printed. Behind her, a line of men in seed company caps shifted their weight and traded looks, because the parcel she was buying had been on the county's books for 11 years, and in those 11 years, not one soul had wanted it. 40 acres of standing reed and black muck out past the Tallow Creek bottoms, land so wet it swallowed fence posts, land the assessor had finally given up on and offered for $1 just to stop mowing the shoulder of the road that touched it. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Roy Pettigrew, who knew everyone's business before they knew it themselves, printed the deed and pushed it across and said plainly that she'd just paid $1 too much. The men behind her chuckled. Delia folded the deed into her coat and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She was 23 years old back in Wexler County after 4 years away, living alone in her late grandfather's house at the end of Sorrel Ridge Road. And she had not come home with a plan so much as she had come home because there was nowhere else that felt like a floor beneath her. If you are the sort of person who has ever been told that the thing you value isn't worth anything, take a second right now to like this video and leave a comment telling me the town or the county you're watching from, because I read them, and because stories like this one belong to people scattered across a lot of small places that the rest of the world drives past. Now let me take you back to the reed swamp, and to the Hogs, and to what had been sitting under that black water for 40 years, while everyone agreed there was nothing out there but mud. Delia had grown up on the edge of that bottomland, close enough to hear the frogs at night, close enough to know the smell of the reed swamp when the wind came off it in August. Her grandfather, Alton Marchbanks, had farmed the high ground above the creek his whole life. Corn and a little sorghum and a handful of hogs he kept more out of habit than profit, and he had died the winter Delia turned 19, in the second month of a January so cold the pipes froze in the milk house. She had been away at the time, working a register at a discount store 200 miles south, sending money she couldn't spare, and telling herself she'd come back when things settled, and things did not settle, and then he was gone. And the settling she'd been waiting for turned out to be the kind that happens only after everything has already fallen. She came back for the funeral and stayed 3 days and left. It took 4 more years for the leaving to wear out. When she finally came home for good, she found the farmhouse just as he'd left it, because her great-aunt Verna had kept it that way, refusing to let anyone clear it out, refusing to sell so much as a rocking chair. Verna Marchbanks was 81 that spring, a small woman with hands like knotted rope, who lived in the trailer up the hill and drove a truck older than Delia and wore men's canvas coveralls without a shred of self-consciousness because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm. Verna did not hug her when she arrived. She looked at her a long moment on the porch, took in the thinness of her, the way she stood like someone braced for bad news, and she said only, "You're back then," and went inside to put on coffee. That was the whole of the welcome, and it was more than enough, because Verna's economy of words was a thing Delia had missed the way you miss a familiar weight. The reed swamp came up the second week over that same coffee. Delia had been walking the property lines, restless, and she'd stood at the edge of the county land where it met her grandfather's fence, looking at the wall of reeds taller than she was, gold-brown and rattling in the wind, stretching off toward the creek in a way that swallowed the horizon. She mentioned it to Verna, the way it just sat there, useless, and Verna set down her cup and looked at her over the rim of her glasses and said, "Your grandfather wanted that ground his whole life." Delia said she couldn't imagine why. Verna said, "Because he knew what your great-grandfather buried out there before the water came up." And then she stood, having said exactly one sentence too many and no more, and rinsed her cup, and would not say another word about it that day, no matter how Delia pressed. That was the seed of it, though Delia did not know yet what would grow from it. She turned that sentence over for a week, She knew almost nothing about her great-grandfather beyond his name, Elias Marchbanks, and a photograph on the mantel of a stern man in a collarless shirt, standing beside a team of mules. She knew the creek had shifted its course sometime in the middle of the last century, that a flood in the drought-breaking spring of some year Verna would not pin down had backed up the bottoms and never fully drained, and that the reeds had come in after and made a swamp of what had once been, according to the old survey maps in her grandfather's desk, 40 acres of the best black cropland in the county. She found those maps one night, spread them under the kitchen light, and she saw the parcel marked in her great-grandfather's careful hand, and beside it, in ink faded to the color of weak tea, 3 words she read a dozen times without understanding. The good ground remembers. She did not know what it meant. She only knew that a man does not write a thing like that beside a piece of land he considers lost. And so, the following Tuesday, she went to the county annex with $1, because the parcel had been listed for $1 for over a decade, and she bought 40 acres of reed and muck, while a line of men who owned real land, drained land, corn land, laughed at the back of her neck. Roy Pettigrew told her she'd overpaid. A man named Cletus Harrow, who ran the biggest operation on the west side of the county and never missed a chance to tell you so, leaned against the counter and offered her, as he put it, a fact for her consideration, which was that ground had been worthless when his own daddy was a boy, and it would be worthless when Delia's grandchildren were old, and that the only crop it would ever raise was mosquitoes. Delia folded her deed into her coat. She did not argue. Arguing, she was learning, was for people who needed to be believed. She only needed to be right, and right could wait. The trouble, of course, was that she had bought a swamp, and a swamp does not become cropland by being wished at. She stood at its edge the next morning as the sun came up behind the reeds, and she looked at it for a long time without moving, the way she had a habit of doing, studying the thing before she touched it. And she understood that she had no earthly idea how to drain 40 acres of standing water, and no money to hire it done, and no equipment beyond her grandfather's rusting implements and the old tractor that started one morning out of 3. What she had was a swamp, a $1 deed, a great aunt who spoke in riddles, and 11 hogs. The hogs had been her grandfather's. A mongrel drift of them descended from stock Elias himself had kept, dark-haired and long-snouted and half-wild, kept now more by Verna's stubbornness than by any purpose, rooting through the woodlot above the house and coming to the fence at feeding time. They were not fine hogs. They were not the pink-penned, corn-fattened animals that Cletus Harrow trucked to market by the hundred. They were rangy and rootin' and independent, and the feed store men called them razorbacks and worse, and considered them a nuisance and an embarrassment, a leftover from a poorer time. Delia looked at the hogs and she looked at the swamp, and something in the back of her mind, some half-thought she could not yet finish, began to turn. It was Verna who finished it, though she did it the way she did everything, sideways and without ceremony. Delia had been trying, in the first weeks, to figure out how to drain the eastern edge of the parcel, digging by hand at an old blocked culvert, coming home each night soaked to the waist and no closer. And Verna watched her at it for the better part of a month before she said anything. Then one evening, as Delia scraped mud from her boots on the porch step, Verna said from her rocker that Elias never drained that ground either. Delia said she thought that was the whole point, that it needed draining. Verna said, no. She said, your great-grandfather ran hogs in the reeds. She said it flat, the way you'd report the weather, and she rocked, and she let it sit. Delia stood there with the mud drying on her arms and asked her what she meant, and Verna said only that the reeds and the muck grew things a hog would walk a mile for, roots and tubers and cattail and a bulb the old people called swamp potato, and that Elias never fought the water, he used it, and that the hogs he raised out there were the finest eaten meat in 3 counties, and men came from as far as the rail town to buy them, and that all of it ended when the flood raised the water past what even a hog could work, and the family gave the ground up as lost. But the water, Verna said, had been dropping for years now, slow, an inch a season, and she'd walked the edge herself last fall and seen the mud coming back, seen the swamp potato starting again, and she'd wondered whether anyone in the family had eyes left to see it. Then she got up and went to bed and left Delia standing on the porch with her whole future rearranging itself in the dark. Delia did not sleep much that night. She read the survey maps again, and she read the 3 faded words again. The good ground remembers, and this time they cracked open a little. She understood that her great-grandfather had not meant the ground would remember him. He had meant the ground itself held memory, that the black muck beneath the reeds was the same rich bottomland it had always been, only sleeping under water, only waiting, and that anything drawing life from it would draw the goodness up. The next morning she did not go dig at the culvert. She stood at the fence and she watched the hogs, and she watched the reeds, and she made a decision that every person she knew would have told her was foolish, which was that she would not fight the swamp at all. She would put the hogs into it. She would let them do what her great-grandfather had let his do, root the black muck for the roots and tubers and swamp potatoes that grew there wild, and she would raise on ground the county had sold her for $1, the kind of meat that could not be raised anywhere else. She did not tell anyone the plan, because a plan spoken too early is only a target for other people's certainty, and she had all the certainty she could handle already, most of it aimed at her. Getting the hogs into the reeds was its own slow education. She spent the tail end of that spring in the front of summer building a low fence of woven wire and cedar posts along the drier margin, working alone in the heat with the deer flies at her neck, sinking posts into ground that fought her for every one. And she learned quickly why her grandfather had let the swamp be, because there is no labor on this earth quite like fencing a marsh. She kept a notebook in her back pocket, a habit from nowhere she could name, and she wrote down everything: the depth of the water at the culvert each week, the places the hogs favored, the plants they went after first. She turned the 11 hogs out onto the eastern quarter in the first week of June, and she stood at the fence and watched them hesitate at the edge of the mud, and then watched the big old sow, the one Verna called Bramble for, the way she'd tear through anything, wade in up to her belly and drop her snout and come up with a mouthful of pale roots. And she watched the others follow, and she understood in that moment that Verna had been telling the truth, that the ground remembered, and that she had just become, without anyone's permission, a hog farmer on a swamp. Word got to the feed store before the hogs had been in the reeds a fortnight, because word always got to the feed store, and the feed store was where Cletus Harrow held court on Saturday mornings among the men who'd known him and his father, and considered his opinions a kind of local weather. When Delia came in for wire staples that July, the talk stopped the way talk does, and then Cletus, who could not let a thing lie, asked her how her mosquito ranch was coming. The men laughed. Delia bought her staples. She said the hogs seemed to like it fine, which was true, and she left. And behind her, Cletus offered the room another fact for its consideration, which was that a hog raised in filth would taste like filth, that penned corn-fed pork was the only pork worth the name, that the old way of running hogs in the woods and swamps had died out because it deserved to, and that this girl would learn what her grandfather already knew, that there was no money in the bottoms and never had been, and that she'd be selling that dollar swamp back to the county before 2 winters were out. Only they wouldn't take it. He was so sure of it that a man named Pruitt wrote it down as a joke on the feed store calendar, 2 winters, and everyone thought that was very funny. And I want you to remember that calendar, because the county land was going to outlast the man who mocked it, and the calendar would still be hanging on that wall when the fact for consideration turned out to be the wrong fact entirely. That first summer taught Delia the shape of patience. The hogs worked the reeds and grew, and they did not grow the way Cletus's corn-fed animals grew, fast and soft and uniform. They grew slow and lean and hard-muscled, marbled through with fat the color of cream, from the roots and mast they foraged. And Delia could not have told you they were doing anything remarkable except that Verna, who never praised anything, walked the fence line with her one September evening and looked at Bramble and the growing shoats and said, "Your great-grandfather would know these." That was all. But Delia wrote it in the notebook, because coming from Verna, it was the same as a parade. The water kept dropping. By the fall, the eastern quarter had firmed enough that Delia could walk it in boots, and where the hogs had rooted the reeds back, the black muck lay exposed. And in that muck, come the following spring, things began to grow that Delia had not planted. Volunteer squash and amaranth, and a low green mat she couldn't name, because the ground the hogs had opened was exactly as her great-grandfather had written, remembering what it had been. She butchered the first hog in November, one of the shoats, alone in the cold with her grandfather's knives and a book of Verna's on how it was done. And she was clumsy at it, and it took her all day, and half of it she got wrong. But when she cooked a piece of the shoulder that night in a cast-iron pan with nothing but salt and tasted it, she set down her fork and sat very still. She had eaten pork her whole life. She had never eaten anything like this. It was dense and clean and faintly sweet, with a depth to the fat that coated the tongue and would not let go, nothing at all like the pale, wet meat from the store. And she understood then, fully and finely, what her great-grandfather had known and what Cletus Harrow would never taste because he was too certain to try. She took a portion up the hill to Verna the next morning. Verna cooked it the same way, salt and iron and heat, and she ate it slowly. And when she was done, she looked out the window a long time, and she said, in a voice Delia had never heard her use, that it tasted like her childhood, like Sunday dinners at Elias's table, like a thing she'd thought was gone from the world. Then she wiped her eyes with the back of her rope-knuckled hand, once, quick, so you'd have missed it if you weren't watching, and she said, "Don't you sell that to just anybody?" And Delia said she wouldn't. She did not have a market, and she did not know how to build one, so she did the only thing she knew, which was to let the meat speak for itself. She took a shoulder to the little diner in the town of Rushmere Landing, 6 miles down the creek, where a woman named Hollis Tandy ran the kitchen and had a reputation for cooking one special a week that people drove to get. And she told Hollis nothing except that she'd raised the hog on the old bottomland, and would Hollis just taste it. Hollis, who had tasted 1,000 men's hogs and been unimpressed by most, put a piece in a pan out of politeness, and then she put a second piece in the pan out of curiosity. And then she came out from the kitchen, wiping her hands, and asked Delia how many she could get and how soon. That was the first sale. Hollis put it on as the Saturday special and called it, on the little chalkboard, Bottomland Pork, and she did not say where it came from beyond that. And the special sold out by 1 in the afternoon, and the next Saturday it sold out by noon, and the Saturday after that there was a line at the door of the diner in Rushmere Landing before Hollis had the coffee on, and none of it was advertised, because Delia never advertised anything in her life, and every bit of it moved on the oldest engine there is, which is a person telling another person, "You have got to taste this." The line at the diner was how the wider county came to know, and the way the wider county comes to know a thing is through its gas station, and the gas station at the Rushmere Junction was run by a talkative young man named Doby Ketterson, who knew every car that passed and made it his business to know why. Doby tasted the Bottomland Pork at the diner, like everyone else, and then he could not stop talking about it to every soul who pulled up to his pumps, and it was Doby who first said the thing that would follow Delia for years, which was that the county had sold that girl a swamp for $1, and she was making it worth more than Cletus Harrow's whole West Side operation. And though that wasn't yet true, it had the shape of a thing that wanted to be true, and Doby said it so often that people started saying it back to him. A chef from the city an hour east heard about it from a cousin who'd stopped for gas and drove out one Saturday and stood in the line at Hollis's diner and ate, and then found out where the diner got the pork and drove up Sorrel Ridge Road to find Delia mending fence in the reeds, and offered her more per hog than she'd ever imagined a hog could bring, and asked whether she could raise more. Delia looked at him a long moment, the way she looked at everything, and she said she could raise more, but only as fast as the ground would allow, and not one hog faster, because the whole of the thing was the ground, and you could not hurry a swamp. The chef, whose name was Marcus Finn, and who had spent his life around people who wanted everything faster, looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language, and then he understood, and he shook her muddy hand, and he became, without either of them planning it, the thing that carried her meat into the city. She grew, but she grew the way Verna had taught her without ever teaching her, which was the only way she knew how, which was slowly and without debt. She could have borrowed against the demand. Marcus Finn told her she could have 10 times the hogs and sell every one, and a man from the bank in the county seat, having heard about the diner line and the city chef, actually drove out to Sorrel Ridge Road to offer her money, sitting in her grandfather's kitchen and laying out a plan to drain the whole 40 acres and pen 1,000 hogs and become, as he put it, a real operation. Delia listened to all of it. Then she said no, and the no unsettled him, because bankers are not used to being told no by a woman in a mud-caked coat who owns a dollar swamp. She said that the hogs were what they were because the ground was what it was, and that you could not put 1,000 hogs on ground that fed 11 and expect the meat to stay the meat, and that if she drained the reeds, she would kill the very thing she was selling, and that she did not want to be a real operation. She wanted to raise the finest hogs in the state on ground that remembered how, and that she would do it as fast as the ground allowed and no faster, and that this was not a plan she was willing to discuss. The banker left. He told people in town she'd turned down a fortune, and he said it the way you'd talk about someone who wasn't quite right in the head, and some of them agreed, and some of them were beginning, quietly, to wonder if she knew something they didn't. The second summer she doubled the herd, which is to say she went from 11 hogs to 22, because that was what the reeds could carry, once the hogs themselves had opened more of the swamp to forage, and this was the thing the banker and Cletus and the whole logic of scale could never grasp. That the ground got better the more it was worked the right way, that the rooting of the hogs opened the muck to sun and seed, and turned reed and cattail into pasture over years, so that each season the 40 acres could feed a few more animals than the last, not because Delia forced it, but because she followed it. She kept the notebook faithfully. She wrote down the water depth and the forage, and the weight of the hogs and the days they favored one part of the swamp over another. And slowly the notebook became a thing her great-grandfather would have recognized, a record of the ground's remembering, and one winter night she found, in the bottom of her grandfather's desk, a similar notebook in Elias's hand, water-stained and half-ruined, and she opened it and found the same kinds of entries in the same kind of shorthand. The water at the culvert, the swamp potato coming in, the hogs favoring the north reeds after the first frost, and she sat on the floor of her grandfather's house and read a dead man's patience matching her own line for line. And she understood she had not invented anything. She had only remembered it, the way the ground had. Cletus Harrow came to the fence in the 3rd year, alone, on a gray afternoon in the tag end of winter, and he stood at the woven wire and watched the hogs work the reeds for a long while before Delia noticed him and came over. She had not spoken to him since the Mosquito Ranch remark, and she braced for another fact offered for her consideration. But Cletus did not offer her a fact. He watched Bramble, older now and grizzled but still the boss of the drift, tear a mat of roots loose and eat, and he said, quiet, that he'd tasted her pork at his daughter's wedding, that his daughter had insisted on it over his objection, that he'd expected to be able to prove it was nothing, and that he had not been able to prove it was nothing because it was the best meat he'd put in his mouth in 70 years, and he'd been raising hogs for 50 of them. He said his own animals, penned and corn-fed and hurried to wait, were feeding people, and there was no shame in feeding people, but they were not this, and he knew now they would never be this. And he'd driven out to say so because a man who'd said the things he'd said ought to have the decency to unsay them to the person's face. He did not make a large production of it. He said it plainly, the way he said everything. And then he asked her, without quite looking at her, whether she needed any help come farrowing time, because he had equipment and hands and time on his side of the county, and he'd sooner see it used well than see it sit. Delia looked at him a long moment. Then she said she could use a good hand at farrowing, and that was the whole of the reconciliation, two people at a fence agreeing to work, and it was worth more than any apology dressed up in speeches. Word of Cletus Harrow eating crow spread through the feed store faster than the pork had, and the feed store calendar with 2 winners written on it in Pruitt's hand became a quiet embarrassment. And one Saturday Pruitt took it down and threw it out, and nobody said anything, which was how the men of Wexler County acknowledged they'd been wrong by removing the evidence and never speaking of it. Delia went on the same as before, because Vindication changed nothing about the work. The work was still fencing and farrowing and the slow reading of the ground, and she still stood at the edge of the reeds each morning and looked at them a long time before she began. Marcus Fenn's restaurant in the city put bottomland pork on its menu and named the farm on the plate, Sorrel Ridge, and food writers came, and one of them wrote a long piece about a young woman raising hogs on a swamp the county had sold for $1, about the meat that could not be gotten anywhere else, about the ground that remembered, and the piece used those words, the good ground remembers, because Delia had told the writer the story of the faded note, and the writer had understood that it was the whole story. After that, the demand was more than the 40 acres could ever hope to fill, and Delia turned people away every week, and turning people away, she found, was the surest sign that she'd built the thing right, because a thing everyone can have is a thing no one prizes. Verna weakened in the 4th spring. She was 85 and had worked her whole life, and her body had begun, at last, to hand back the wages of it, and she took to her bed in the trailer up the hill, and Delia moved a cot in and cared for her through the greening of the reeds and the farrowing of the hogs, running down the hill at dawn to check the drift and back up to sit with the old woman through the long afternoons. Verna did not complain, because complaint was not in her, and mostly she slept, but on the good days she asked about the swamp, how deep the water stood at the culvert, whether the swamp potato had come in thick, which part of the reeds the hogs were favoring, and Delia would read to her from the notebook, her own and Elias's both, and Verna would close her eyes and listen the way you'd listen to music. One afternoon near the end, with the window open and the frogs starting up in the bottoms below, Verna said, without opening her eyes, that she'd known the ground wasn't dead. She said she'd walked that fence every fall for 40 years and watched the water drop an inch at a time and wait for someone in the family to have the eyes to see it, and that she'd about given up. And then Delia had come home with no plan and had stood at the fence and looked at the reeds the way Elias used to look at them, a long time before touching anything, and Verna had known right then. She said, "You looked at it the right way." That was the last long thing she said. She died a week later, in the 2nd month of that spring, quiet, in the trailer with the window open, and the frogs went right on singing in the bottoms as if nothing at all had changed. And in the way that matters most, nothing had, because the ground remembered her too now, and the hogs, and the girl who'd learned to read them. Delia buried her great-aunt beside Elias and Alton in the little family plot on the high ground above the reeds, where the 3 of them could look out over the bottomland that the county had given up on and the family had never quite let go. And she did not make a ceremony of the grief any more than Verna would have wanted. She went back to work, because the work was the grief, and the grief was the work, and there was no line between them any more. She kept both notebooks now on the kitchen table, Elias's and her own, and she'd begun a 3rd, because the 2nd one was nearly full. 4 years of the ground's remembering set down in her own hand, and she understood that the notebooks were the real inheritance, more than the house or the hogs or even the dollar swamp. They were the memory the ground kept when the people who'd read it were gone, and she meant to keep it faithfully so that whoever came after her someday could stand at the fence and know how to look. She did expand in the 5th year, but she expanded the way she'd done everything, which was slowly and by following the ground rather than forcing it. The eastern quarter had firmed enough over the years of hog rooting that it would carry more animals, and the water had dropped enough at the culvert that the northern reeds were opening on their own, and so she let the herd grow again, not to 1,000 and not to 100, but to 40. 1 hog for each acre the county had sold her, and she said, when Marcus Finn asked whether she'd go bigger, that 40 acres would raise 40 hogs the right way and could not raise 41, and that she'd sooner keep it at 40 forever and turn people away than take on 1 animal more than the ground could feed with its whole heart. Cletus Harrow, who came now most weeks to help, and who had become, in the plain, wordless way of old rural men, something like a friend, told her she was leaving money in the field, and she said she knew, and that money left in the field was how you knew the field was still worth working. And Cletus, who had spent his life gathering every last dollar a field would give and watching his fields grow tired for it, thought about that a long time and then said she might be right. And coming from him, it was the same as Verna's parade. The county assessor drove out that 5th autumn, a new one, young, sent to reassess the parcel because word had reached even the annex that the dollar swamp was famous now, and he stood at the fence with his clipboard and looked at 40 hogs working 40 acres of reed and firming muck, and he did not know quite how to value it, because there was no line on his form for ground that remembered, no column for a thing that could not be gotten anywhere else, and in the end, he wrote down a number that was many thousands of times the dollar Delia had paid. And Delia looked at the notice when it came and set it on the table beside the notebooks and paid the tax without complaint, because the tax was the county finally admitting, in the only language the county spoke, that it had been wrong, that the ground it had given up on for 11 years and sold for a single crumpled bill had been all along exactly what her great-grandfather said it was. She did not gloat. She did not drive to the annex and slide the notice under Roy Pettigrew's nose. She only wrote in the notebook that evening the water depth at the culvert and the forage and the weight of the hogs, and then, below it, without ceremony, the assessed value, so that the ground's own record would show what it had been worth once someone had the eyes to see it. The years settled into their rhythm after that, seasons stacking up like cordwood, and the story might have stopped being a story and become simply a life, which is the best thing a story can become, except that stories are for telling, and this one got told over and over, at the diner in Rushmere Landing, and the gas station at the junction, and the feed store where the calendar had once hung, until it became the thing the county pointed to, the girl in the swamp, and the dollar. And though Delia never told it herself, never once, she let the others tell it, because the telling did the ground no harm and it did some good, she thought, for the other people out there sitting on some worthless seeming thing, some piece of themselves or their land or their family that everyone had agreed wasn't worth the trouble. To hear that the trouble was sometimes the whole point, and the worthlessness only the not yet seen. On the porch in the evenings, with the notebooks on the table and the frogs coming up loud from the bottoms, she'd sometimes take out the old survey map with the 3 faded words and read them again, the good ground remembers, and she'd think that they were the truest thing anyone in her family had ever written down, and that her great-grandfather had known, standing at that same fence 100 years before, that the water would drop and the muck would wait, and that someday someone would come who knew how to look, and that his whole faith had been in the ground and in the family's eyes, and that both had held. She never married, and she never left again, and she never grew the herd past 40, and she never advertised a single hog, and every year the demand outran the supply, and every year she turned people away, and every year the turning away kept the meat rare and prized, and the ground healthy, and the whole enterprise honest. And she understood, better each season, that she had built the one kind of thing that can't be bought and can't be scaled and can't be hurried, which is a thing that is exactly what it is and no more, raised at exactly the pace the ground allows, worth precisely as much as it is worth, and not a penny inflated by wanting. Cletus Harrow died in the 9th year, an old man surrounded by fields he'd worked to exhaustion. And at the end he told his own children that the best thing he'd learned in 50 years of hogs, he'd learned from a girl at a fence in the last decade of his life, which was that the ground gives back what you give it and no more, and that he'd spent his whole life taking and had only figured out too late how to keep. And his children didn't fully understand him, but they wrote it down because he asked them to. And that, too, was a kind of notebook, a kind of remembering passed on. The last picture I want to leave you with is Delia at the fence, years on, older now, her hands going the way of Verna's, knotted and strong, standing at the edge of the reeds in the early light the way she stood there the first morning she owned the place, looking a long time before she moves, because that habit never left her and never would. The reeds rattle gold-brown in the wind the way they always have, and behind them the black muck the hogs have opened over the years lies rich in remembering, and Bramble is long gone, but her line runs on in the drift that works the swamp, and the water still drops its slow inch each season, and the notebooks on the kitchen table number 7 now. 40 years of the ground's memory set down in 3 different hands, and somewhere up on the high ground 3 graves look down over the whole of it. Over 40 acres the county sold for $1, and could not, in the end, put a number on, because the number that mattered was never in dollars. It was in the taste of the meat, and the health of the ground, and the faith of a man who wrote before the water came up that the good ground remembers, and was right, and lived long enough in his family's eyes to be proven so. Delia stands at the fence. She looks a long time. Then she opens the gate and goes in, and the ground receives her the way it has always received the ones who knew how to look, and that is the whole of it, and it is enough. If someone in your life has ever been told that what they have, or what they are, or the small worn-down thing they love isn't worth the trouble, do me a favor and send them this story, because they may need to hear that worth has a way of proving itself slowly, without arguing, just by being true. Leave me a comment about the thing in your own life that people wrote off and you kept anyway, because I want to know, and tell me the town or the county or the corner of the world you're watching from tonight, whether it's a place with reeds and bottomland or a city block 1,000 miles from any farm, and I will read every last one of them, the way you read a notebook, slowly, looking for what the ground remembers. But the story did not quite end at the gate, because there was one more thing that came to Delia in the late years. One more turning she had not planned any more than she'd planned the rest of it. A girl showed up on Sorrel Ridge Road one spring, 16, maybe 17, dropped off at the end of the lane by a car that didn't wait. A distant cousin's daughter named Winnie Halloran, whom Delia had met exactly once at a funeral and barely remembered, sent up from 2 counties south because there was trouble at home of the kind nobody wanted to name out loud. And the girl stood at the fence with a duffel bag and a face closed up like a fist. And Delia looked at her a long time, the way she looked at everything. And then she said only, "You can stay," and went back to mending wire. That was the whole of the welcome, and Winnie recognized it later for what it was, more than enough. The same thing Verna had given Delia on a porch a lifetime before, a floor to stand on, offered without ceremony. The girl was no help at all the first month. She hated the mud and the smell and the deer flies and the way the days started before light, and she said so, and Delia let her say it and handed her a pair of boots anyway. But Winnie had the one thing that mattered, which Delia saw the first week and said nothing about, because a thing named too early becomes a target. And the thing was this: the girl looked. She'd stand at the fence when she thought no one was watching and just look at the reeds, at the hogs working the muck, at the water lying flat and black beyond the woven wire, and she'd look a long time, the way you look at something you don't understand but can't leave alone. And Delia knew that look because she had worn it herself at the same age, standing at the same fence, and she understood that the ground had gone and done it again, had drawn someone in who knew how to look before they knew what they were looking at. So Delia taught her the way Verna had taught, which was mostly by not teaching, by handing her the notebook one evening and saying, "Write down the water at the culvert," and by letting her get the butchering wrong the first time and the second, and by the third time getting it nearly right, and by walking the fence line beside her in silence and letting the silence do the instruction. She told her about Elias and the flood and the dollar deed, and she showed her the survey map with the 3 faded words, and she watched the girl read them a dozen times without understanding, exactly as Delia had. And she did not explain them, because some things you have to remember on your own or they don't take. It was near 2 years before Winnie came in from the reeds one August evening, mud to her waist, and set down her boots on the porch step and said, quiet, that she thought she finally got it, the words on the map, that the ground didn't remember Elias, the ground remembered being good, and everything they raised on it just pulled the goodness up. Delia set down her coffee. She looked at the girl a long moment. Then she said, "That's it," and it was the same as Verna's parade, and Winnie carried it the rest of her life. Delia died in her 80th year, in the 2nd month of spring, in the farmhouse at the end of Sorrel Ridge Road, with the window open and the frogs coming up loud from the bottoms, and Winnie was with her, grown now, a woman of the ground herself. And near the end, Delia said, without opening her eyes, that she'd known the girl wasn't lost the first time she saw her look at the reeds, the way Verna had known about Delia, the way Elias must have hoped, standing at his fence before the water came, that someone down the long line of 'em would have the eyes. She said, "You looked at it the right way," the same words Verna had given her, handed down now like the boots and the knives and the 7 notebooks that had become 9. And then she was quiet, and the frogs sang on as if nothing had changed, and in the way that mattered most, nothing had. Winnie buried her beside Verna and Alton and Elias on the high ground. 4 graves now looking down over 40 acres the county had once sold for $1 and could no longer put a number on, and she did not make a ceremony of it because Delia would not have wanted one. She went back to work because the work was the grief and the grief was the work, and there had never been a line between them in that family. She kept the herd at 40. She never advertised a single hog. She started a new notebook, the 10th, and wrote in it the water depth at the culvert, and the forage, and the weight of the hogs, in her own hand now, added to the long conversation of hands that stretched back 100 years into the black remembering muck. And each morning she stood at the fence and looked a long time before she moved, because that was how you did it. That was the whole of it, and it was enough.